Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. What makes something beautiful? We look at a sunset, a tree, a distant nebula, a woman's face, or a work of art, and we call it beautiful. What do we mean? As Christians, we believe beauty, like truth and goodness, is actually a reflection of God's own nature. Beauty transcends the things in which we see it shining because God is beauty itself. But if God is the measure of beauty, does that mean beauty is not really in the eye of the beholder? Are there things that cannot be called beautiful? If falsehood negates truth and evil negates goodness, is there ugliness that negates beauty? Can perhaps even some types of art be called ugly? What is art anyway? And what is its role in teaching us about beauty? Well, joining me today is someone who can help us wrestle through these questions. And after I saw a presentation he gave for the Center for Faith and Inquiry, I knew a conversation with him would involve a bit of wrestling, and certainly more than just easy answers. Bruce Herman is a professor of art and distinguished chair in the fine arts at Gordon College. He's the founder of the college's art department, and his work has been exhibited internationally and is housed in museums from the Vatican Museum in Rome to the Armand Hammer Collection in Los Angeles. Professor Herman joins me today to ask and answer the question, what is beauty, and how does it teach us about the master artist? Professor Herman, welcome to Upstream.
Hi, Shane. Thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be part of this larger conversation that you have initiated. Thank you.
Well, first of all, tell me about the location where you're at, because those of us who are not watching it on video won't be able to tell, but we can kind of hear the ambiance. Where are you at and what's around you?
Well, I'm in the art gallery at Gordon College, and we are currently surrounded by a number of paintings, about 25 paintings of mine. I seldom ever have shown my own work here in the gallery, but I'm retiring from my faculty position after 38 years in literally 1 week. And there's a kind of a celebration. They're saying, goodbye, Bruce. And part of that is to exhibit my work. And so that's what you're hearing, a bit of an echo because it's a large space. It's got 14-foot tall ceilings and a sky well that goes up to the ceiling, the roof, which is 25 feet. So you get a bit of echo. I apologize for that. I'll try to articulate.
You gave me sort of a visual tour with the webcam a moment ago before we started recording. And so these paintings have a whole range of subject matter. Could you tell me about a couple of them and what your style is? What is it that makes a Bruce Herman painting?
My work lives in a kind of an odd liminal space between the traditional, what we would think of as traditional realistic art, or the tradition of the human form and recognizable subject matter like a landscape, a still life, a portrait, and also modern or contemporary art, which is, as most people know, is otherwise focused than what we would consider traditional. In fact, in many cases, non-objective, even non-representational at all. And I've tried to marry those traditions, the more recent, what we call abstract art, and then the tradition of the narrative and the human figure. So there's an odd sort of liminal space that I inhabit as a painter. And this particular exhibition is mostly from one project, and it's called Ordinary Saints. And it began with a portrait of my father that I made right after he died in 2009 as a way of working through my feelings. We all, have a hole in our heart when our parents die. My mother died 3 months later, both of them unexpectedly. They were, in their 80s, but they were in good health. So it was a bit of a shock, and I did a portrait of my mother as well. Then a British poet, some of you have heard of, Malcolm Guite, wrote an ekphrastic poem, which is a poem written in response to a work of visual art. He wrote an ekphrastic poem in response to the painting of my dad, and then asked if he could see more of my paintings. But I was beginning to paint a lot of the people I love. My wife, my son, my daughter, my grandchildren, and then friends. And he's written 20-some poems now. And he and I invited a composer, Jack Redford, who has set some of Malcolm's work to music in the past, to join us. So the three of us have created this body of work, an hour and a quarter chamber orchestra suite called Ordinary Saints, Malcolm's body of poetry and these 25 paintings of mine, and it's part of this larger project, Ordinary Saints. And that's what's on exhibition here now. And I'll just, for those who are on video, I'll just show you the gallery, some of the walls of the gallery. Also in this exhibition are some larger works that comprise another collaboration I did with the painter Makoto Fujimura a few years earlier, entitled Quartets, in which both of us, Mako and myself, along with Chris Theophanidis, who teaches graduate composition at Yale, Chris wrote a musical quartet called At the Still Point. Mako and I did a body of work, all of us in response to T.S. Eliot's wonderful magnum opus for quartets. And so I've brought in 4 of those larger paintings. So that's what we're in right now.
Well, of course, a few of those names you just dropped will be familiar to my listeners. Christians who are engaged in the arts will recognize Gait, Fujimura as figures who are exploring through various media this issue of beauty. And because art is caught up in beauty, it's almost in many ways synonymous in our minds. Of course, there are forays that the world of art has taken into things that I think most Christians look at and are either puzzled or revolted by it. But it's easy for us to forget, especially I think as American Protestants, which comprises the majority of my audience, evangelicals, that the Christian artistic tradition is arguably the richest in the history of the world artistically. This is where some of the great artistic principles were worked out, and actually the greatest manifested in the greatest works, the most famous things. And there are heirs to that tradition who have carried on the work of sort of exploration and discovery and, manifesting beauty. But I think we need to back up for a second and talk about what beauty actually is. So truth, goodness, and beauty have been called the transcendentals. I am involved. My kids go to a classical Christian school. And so these concepts come up a lot. I wonder if you could give us a primer on where the idea of these 3 transcendentals comes from and how Christians have used them over the centuries, especially beauty.
These 3 transcendental realities are embedded in the character of God, the very nature of our Creator. And they are interwoven in such a way that you cannot tease them apart without doing violence to one or the other. So, for example, imagine beauty without goodness or truth. Well, it would be a seduction at best. Imagine goodness without truth. Well, it would be sentimental. Maybe some sort of trite, notional thing about virtue without its being embedded in truth. And you can go on. You can do this all day long. But what you'll find is a travesty is created by subtracting one or the other of these deeply interwoven realities that I think are embedded in God. Like the Trinity, the very character of God is threefold, 3 in 1. And that oneness or that interwoven quality is also in the character of God, in the mutual submission that is modeled for us in the Holy Trinity, where the Father prefers the honor of the Son wants to glorify and obey the Father. The Holy Spirit is servant of both in bringing God's word and God's image to us and in imbuing our lives with those qualities. So that's the first thing I would say, is that beauty, like truth and goodness, is anchored in God. So then the question would be, well, so what does it look like? Because we think of beauty as primarily visual. And of course, as a visual artist, that's the wellspring of everything that I've been working at and responding to my whole life. In fact, since I was a little boy, I knew I was going to be an artist when I was 6 years old. And it was because of beauty. It was because I was overwhelmed by it. It brought me to tears from time to time. I could go on, but I'd like to ask you, Shane, because I'm not interested in monologue so much as dialogue here. Where are you finding yourself as you're interacting with your children, with your church? Where does beauty figure into your life in concrete ways? And maybe we can talk about it in more specific terms and instead of this purely theoretical realm.
That's very good. I would say, so I have always loved to draw, sketch. Color pencils are my favorite medium. And it's just sort of a, side hobby. My wife does something similar with watercolors. She likes to use pens to sort of highlight the watercolors. So her style ends up looking like a Beatrix Potter sort of thing. But I would say that for me, beauty has predominantly arrested me and been obvious to me in nature. So in God's own creation, in the natural world. So I collected insects as a kid because I was an uber nerd. And when I see the symmetry in mirror image on, say, a butterfly's wings or a moth's wings or a beetle or something like that, when I see the structure of the veins in a leaf, a deciduous leaf, and then the different border shapes that you have on the leaf and the infinite variety between species, and then the grand cathedral of that kind of art you find when you walk into a forest. I spent the last night at a camp where some of the middle schoolers from my kids' classical school were staying. So I was one of the chaperones, and it's in the middle of this forest here in Florida, and I'm from Florida. So it's like a rainforest. It looks like a jungle out there. I just couldn't stop being captivated by everything around me. And I've always been that way. So I think of beauty in those terms first, and then I sort of work that into my understanding of man-made beauty. So the things that we do in art or architecture or music, for me, sort of harken back to themes I've seen in nature.
Right. So, I mean, there's a perfect example that you've just raised, which is the forest as a place of origin for human culture and human flourishing is echoed in the architecture of the Greeks with the columns of the Parthenon and the pediments above, which are like the boughs of the tree, the columns being the trunk of the sacred grove of trees. And much of human artifact making is derived from the forest in particular, but also from floral patterns. If you look at some of the patterning on cloth, on buildings, even on people's self-decoration. You think about right to contemporary tattoos, right? We can't stop recording our fascination with and our utter inspiration from those forms which God has provided for us. Another aspect of beauty I'd like to bring out, and that is, it does appear that our Lord has preferences for certain kinds of forms, or he seems to delight in them. For example, the sphere. There's no end of spheres. As you go from tiny microscopic things like pollen. I don't know if you've ever seen pollen under an electron microscope, but it looks like spiky planets or bizarre sorts of star systems. And then looking through the Webb telescope, newly minted photographs of distances and spaces and objects that we can't even conceive of. They're so immense. And yet that same shape, a sphere, continues to operate within those microscopic and telescopic images. Same thing's true of the spiral, and we can go on. We can think of the fern form or the form of a branching tree. Our vascular system, T.S. Eliot says in the beginning of Four Quartets, garlic and sapphires in the mud, clot the bedded axletree, the trilling wire in the blood sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long forgotten wars. The dance along the arteries, the circulation of the lymph are figured in the drift of stars. I mean, he goes on to say, ascend to summer in the tree, we move above the moving tree, in light upon the figured leaf, and here upon the sodden floor below the boarhound and the boar pursue their pattern as before, but reconciled among the stars at the still point of the turning world. And he goes on, but it's all nature imagery. And it's the mirroring of nature, both at a cosmic level and at a local landscape level, in our own bodies, which is, I believe, great poets like Eliot and painters and composers, what we are doing is we are trying to respond adequately to these forms which God employs in his ceaseless exploration of creative possibilities and risk-taking. And yeah, there's a lot there, but beauty is deeply interwoven with all of that.
So one of the interesting and provocative things you said in the discussion or lecture that I mentioned in the introduction was that beauty is difficult, nigh unto impossibility to define. I know that a lot of people have attempted definitions of beauty, and it seems like you're gesturing in the direction of a a meaning for the word beauty. I mean, obviously it's a word. It has to have a meaning, just practically speaking. But what do you think about that? Is that still kind of your thinking that beauty is impossible to define, or is there something we can say about it that's more concrete?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think to try to define beauty is a category mistake. It's a fundamental mistake to try to define it, because beauty participates in and evokes aspects of our encounter with God's creation that are transverbal. In fact, that's why we have music. That's why we have art. Even, I would say, poetry, which obviously employs verbal means, but it pushes words to the breaking point so that they spill multivalent meanings. So it doesn't mean in one direction, these forms, the things that we call beautiful. To try to define them is actually, in a way, to do violence to them. That's not what you do with beauty. You celebrate beauty. You don't define it.
I like that. And it's an experiential sort of definition, because it mirrors how we actually encounter these things, right? I mean, the purpose of music is to be heard. You cannot describe it in words that do justice to it, just like you can't describe a natural landscape in words that do justice to it. So the most reverent thing to do might be to sit down and paint it, but right. you can't convey it in words. Words are their own form of conveyance.
Yeah, I can't remember who the composer is, but someone told me a story about it. I want to say Beethoven, but I'm not sure it's Beethoven, was asked to explain a piece that he had written. And he said, "Oh, yes, of course." And he sat down at the piano and played it again. He's asked to explain the work, and he just said, "Sure, here I go." And he performed it again.
So in light of this, I think that's an intuitively correct understanding. In light of this, I want to go back to the question I sort of implied or posed at the beginning, which is, if there is beauty, if there are corresponding negations of truth and goodness, there's falsehood and badness, is there ugliness? Is there a perversion of the created forms that we are celebrating in beauty? And if so, what does that look like, and how does it enter the arts? What are your thoughts on that?
The word ugly it has ugly connotations, doesn't it? I mean, it's not a word we use very often, simply because it involves a certain kind of a judgment that one has to make. So then the question becomes, how do you judge? What are the criteria that you need to employ in order to decide whether something is beautiful or not, or more beautiful or less beautiful? Augustine talked about goodness and evil in terms that are quite interesting. He talked about evil as privatio boni. In other words, the absence of good, not as something in itself. So evil is not a presence. It's an absence. It's a loss. It's a hole. It's a hollowness at the heart of the broken reality that we all encounter in our lives. And I would say there's something similar with beauty. It's not so much that there's something that's ugly or that has any kind of positive existence in itself. It's an absence of the beautiful. The thing about the beautiful is that it's complex. It's not like the truth, which is infinitely intricate and complex. Beauty is equally intricate and complex. It's not something simple as what is pretty. And pretty things can also be beautiful, but prettiness does not exhaust beauty by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, the Webb telescope photographs that are coming now. Those images are unfathomable. And the violence, the catastrophic and unimaginable violence of the birth of a star or an entire galaxy of stars is something, an atomic bomb going off in Hiroshima and melting down the city, or Nagasaki, is as a pinprick in a full blast of the kind of explosions and violence that happens in the birth of a star and that we see in those nebulae. So something so violent, beautiful? Well, actually, yes. We've already problematized notions of beauty that reduce it to what is pretty. It can be awe-inspiring. It can be overwhelming, shocking even. The beautiful is complex. It is not reducible to easily digested notions of prettiness.
This is one of the challenges that I expected we would confront in this conversation that I think will be a challenge for many Christians. In the lecture that you gave, you mentioned a number of artists, including Rothko. Someone will know, be familiar with the sort of horizontal bands of different color and gradients that make up his paintings. And this is something that has often, I guess, been mocked by critics of modern art and so forth. And I look at it and I have to admit, I struggle deeply to see this as what I would think of as art. But you did challenge me on the issue of prettiness and then more deeply on order itself. So it's not appropriate to define beauty only as order or sort of pattern, because many of the things that we intuitively know are beautiful in nature, and this goes back to finding our instruction in God's creation, the nebulae, the supernova, a storm-tossed sea, a raging inferno. These are all manifestations of raw forces, matter in motion, acts of destruction or creation that are extremely chaotic. There's not a lot of order in them. In fact, the definition of some of these things is disorder. A storm-tossed sea is very disorderly, but it is beautiful. And we look at it and we recognize that in nature. There's no one who would look at a storm, even like a destructive power of a hurricane or something like that. There is something beautiful in all these things. And it burst apart these categories, these straightforward categories of what we would say. I think most of the Christian world would intuitively look at art and say, that's what's beautiful. So like a galaxy is very, very similar in many ways to a abstract sort of painting where it's a smattering of color and shapes across a black canvas, very literally. And some art mimics that sort of thing. I'm asking about the ugliness question, and I like the distinction you made, going back to Augustine, about privation being what evil consists of. It doesn't consist of anything. It's an absence. But I asked that question because I'm wondering whether anything can be called beauty and how we avoid the conclusion that beauty is simply subjective. In other words, I could be one of these artists who, puts together the rumpled bed scene or the one with Jesus submerged in urine or something and say, that's beautiful. How would you respond to someone who thought anything is beautiful?
Well, first of all, when you mention concrete examples like Tracy Emmons or Andre Serrano, those are the artists you're talking about, or possibly Robert Rauschenberg and his bed, or Andre Serrano's submersion of a crucifix in his own urine. And then there's another time when he filled a cruciform shape with animal blood, and one that he filled with milk and other kinds of liquids. You could ask the question, so what is the artist intending? Well, let's start with Andre Serrano, his infamous photograph of a crucifix submerged in urine. If you didn't know that was urine, and all you saw was the photograph, I think the actual Cibacone print is about 20 inches by 30 inches, so it's large. And it is glowing, and there's beautiful golden colors in these very atmospheric qualities around it. And the crucifix is turned in such a way that it feels as though Christ himself is being bathed in glory, and there's a kind of a halo throughout the entire photograph. And then if you read the title, it's a giveaway. And then you look at it in the context of the rest of Serrano's work, and he's doing this with blood, he's doing it with milk, he's doing it with other sorts of bodily fluids. And the question he's asking, one of the questions that Serrano is asking is this beautiful? Despite the shame that one might associate with a crucifix submerged in urine. Or let's turn it upside down and go back to the tradition and look at the flagellation of Christ, the whipping of his body, the crowning of his head with thorns, and the blood pouring down his face, or him pinned to a cross. Or let's go even further, beyond the tradition of sacred art. Let's just think about the actual episode in the life of Jesus and his horrendous humiliation, scourging, mocking, being beaten within an inch of his life, and then executed the most ignominious and most painful suffocation death that one could ever imagine. which is how you die on a cross, is from suffocation. Is there anything more ugly? And yet, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, it's foolishness to the Greeks. The intellectuals think this is nonsense. And to the religious, to the Jews, it's a stumbling block. It's offensive. But to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For God has chosen the foolish things to shame the wise and the weak things to shame the strong. Well, he goes on. But the point there is that Andre Serrano, is asking legitimate questions. He's saying, is a crucifix, for example, a little plastic, because it's plastic, is it sacred? Or is the image of Christ still being humiliated? Is that humiliation somehow something we need to take into stock again? And I think what Serrano was doing, quite honestly, I know for a fact because I've read interviews with Serrano, he was asking, can sacred imagery still offend? Because the only sacred imagery that was extant when Serrano did that photograph was all mocking Christian tradition. If there was any indication of Christian symbolism, it would be mocked. He was not mocking it. He was asking hard questions about that blood, about that urine, about that humiliation, about the suffering of Jesus, and whether or not those images are still sacred. But back to your question about beauty and ugliness. If you didn't know what that was and you just saw the photograph, you would think it was beautiful. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful until you find out what it is, which also sets up another set of questions that are very intriguing as we confront the desacralization of imagery in our times and the emptying out of churches. And, you fill out those polls and you check the box that says none of the above, and meaning I'm not religious anymore. Most people have left the church, are no longer considering sacred imagery. But Andre Serrano stubbornly is returning to it in his photography. So it's complicated.
So you wouldn't view that as an act of desecration?
No, I would actually view it as an act of inquiry, especially if you see it in context. It may have involved a form of desecration in order to ask the question, is this thing sacred?
That's really interesting. I want to offer two sort of question counterexamples. So years ago, I went to an exhibit. You may remember this. It toured the country. It was quite controversial. I didn't know it at the time, but it was called Bodies.
Yes,
and it's actually So it's real human bodies that were through a process of plasticizing. It's a resin, were preserved and sort of dissected in various ways that illustrate the bodily system. So there, you can see the circulatory system, skeletal, muscular, everything. The internal organs are preserved. It's quite amazing, and it is quite beautiful on a just sort of aesthetic level. So just like what you were talking about with the halo in the glowing urine. But of course, the controversy arose from the fact that these are real human bodies, and the human body is not a tube of paint. And there were real questions about the legitimacy of the process by which those bodies were procured, I think in China. And so that's one example. Keep that in mind. The second example, as a potential moment where desecration is actually happening. The second example is if you've read That Hideous Strength, which is the third of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. There's a moment in there in Mark Studdock's initiation into the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, the NICE, right? Where he goes to this objective room. And one of the things they try to get him to do is stomp on a picture of Jesus. And he refuses ultimately for reasons he can't quite explain. But that's an important moment in his transition away from the evil side, because they want him to do this act of desecration, even though he doesn't think Jesus is really God, but he won't do it because of some vague sense of uneasiness. So here are two instances that I look at as clear kind of desecration. How do you process those two instances?
Well, are you aware of the book by Shusaku Endo, Silence?
Yeah, this was the one that was adapted into a movie with Andrew Garfield, right?
Yeah, by Martin Scorsese.
I've not read it.
Yeah, Endo's book, it's well worth reading, trust me. It was used in our freshman seminar here at Gordon for a number of years. It was required reading. Every incoming freshman had to read the book and then write an essay in response and enter into dialogue and discussions. in small groups across campus, along with a couple of other texts, including Lewis's Mere Christianity. In that story, the Christian converts in 17th century Japan are forced by the shogun to desecrate images of Christ and Mary by stepping on them. The fumi-e, brass plaques, and those things are still on display in Japan, and they're all worn down from the many times that they'd been stepped on. And if you refused, you were tortured unmercifully and eventually killed, executed, but only after tremendous torture, sometimes weeks and weeks of torture. So the motivation to step on the image, desecrate it, was great in terms of your own personal safety. Many didn't and refused, and they were martyrs. And this actually took place. I mean, you can visit the museum in Kyoto, where they house some of these portraits. The plastinated corpses, a lot of those figures, by the way, were donated to Van Hagen by people that wanted to have their bodies plastinated and made eternal, as it were, in a secular sense of the word. And so the question you're asking is, where is the boundary between what's acceptable use of a human body and what is unacceptable? What's acceptable use of an image of a human person and what's unacceptable?
Especially what's considered a sacred image representing Christ, right?
Yeah, especially a sacred image. And then what constitutes, what is the role of images is another subtext of that conversation. And any of those conversations would be really interesting to have. I think to save time for our interview here and our listeners, not to get too bogged down in a kind of academic rabbit hole, I would just simply say that I think the liminal space between those three transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty, needs to be explored. And it takes a lot of care and a lot of attentiveness. You have to stay awake and not succumb to groupthink. You have to ask for the illumination and guidance of the Holy Spirit if you want to do this carefully. And a lot of philosophers and theologians have tried to do just that. What you're bringing up is that liminal space between what is beautiful and what is good. And like I said earlier, if you subtract goodness or truth from beauty, it becomes a seduction. So that's where idolatry can run rampant. I mean, one of the earliest of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not make any graven image in order to worship it and to bow down to it. What is a sacred image? I mean, there are Protestants who think there are no sacred images. In fact, images are a pollution in worship. We should keep them out.
And I should say I'm not a hardliner on this, but I come from the Reformed tradition, and traditionally Reformed Christians have been very iconoclastic, so no images.
Yeah, exactly. And, St. John of Damascus made his famous defense of images, saying that because of the incarnation, because God came among us and did a self-portrait, I guess you'd call it, in Christ, we are henceforth allowed to have images in worship. We're not allowed to worship the images, but we can worship the one pictured in the image because he allowed himself to be enfleshed, to be embodied. Eliot says the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. So I think there's a deep mystery there. As to whether Van Hagen's bodies exhibit is a sacrilege, I'm not in a position to say definitively. I will tell you that personally I find it repulsive, but a case could be made. I know I have a colleague here at Gordon in the biology department who thinks it was thrilling and honoring of the body because it advances scientific knowledge and it makes people understand, he would argue, it helps people understand how incredibly complex and beautiful and intricate and mysterious the human body is and what an incredible creation it is. But I'll end that thought with one quick pithy quote from George MacDonald, who inspired Lewis and Tolkien and Williams and all those others. George MacDonald said, the flower, thinking of a primrose, is that to know a primrose is a much higher thing than to know all of the botany of it. The photosynthesis and its roots and its stem exist for the face of the flower, not the reverse. So knowing the inner secrets, the botanical secrets of the flower is fine, but don't mistake that for being the meaning of the flower. The meaning of the flower is the face of the flower itself. And I would say the same thing about the human body. Yes, it is incredible. I had my students for years. I've taught at Gordon for 38 years. And I taught figurative painting and drawing. I had them study the skeleton and the musculature in great detail. And it was a painful exercise for them because it's very difficult. But I was very quick to add, you're studying this so that you can render the human form. And the face is supremely the meeting place of persons. The Lord says, seek thou my face. And the psalmist says, thy face, O Lord, shall I seek. It's a delicate territory, this question of the kind of unmasking of nature to be exploited for our uses. And MacDonald would argue that is a distortion of our rightful worship of God. We should be meeting God in the face, not so much tearing open the secrets of nature in order to exploit nature, but in order to be better stewards of nature, to be better at caring for the animals, caring for the plants, caring for the planet, not simply strip mining it to death or polluting the rivers and oceans. The environmental movement has one thing really straight, and that is we are stewards of this planet. We are not the owners.
Two examples come to mind, both from Tolkien, both in The Lord of the Rings. Well, actually, one of them is from the Silmarillion, the prologue to the Silmarillion, that offer, for my mind, because I'm wrestling through this as we're talking, a potential picture of the meeting point of what we would call ugliness and what we would call beauty. So in the themes of Iluvatar, where the god in Tolkien's mythology is creating the world, he and the Ainur, the high angels, are singing the world into existence. So the music is creating the world, or it will create the world eventually. And they don't know what they're doing at the time. And then one of the high angels, whose name is Melkor, rebels. And the way that he rebels is he tries to introduce his own themes into the music that are not from Iluvatar. They're from his own imaginings, and they're discord. They're like, sour notes, so to speak, in a symphony.
He's kind of a Satan figure.
Yeah, exactly. 100% Satan figure. And they don't seem to belong. The interesting thing about this example is that in the end, Iluvatar turns those notes and those themes that Melkor has introduced into the Grand Symphony into a beautiful resolution. So he doesn't excise them from the music. He actually uses them in the music and makes them beautiful in the end. And this is what frustrates Melkor. Second example is one quick little one from The Lord of the Rings, where Samwise and Frodo are in Ithilien, outside of in Gondor, in disputed territory, and there's a statue. This made it into the extended versions of the movies. There's a statue of a Númenorian king who's been beheaded by the orcs, and they put the statue on the ground and they wrapped it in like metal and they tried to desecrate it. They painted red all over it. And in the moment when Sam and Frodo stumble across it, a flowering plant is growing over the top of the king's head. And Sam says, look, Mr. Frodo, the king has a crown again. And there's actually not less beauty, not even a restored beauty, but greater beauty in the resurrection that takes place there symbolically, where the orcs' desecration is actually incorporated into a sort of crucifix almost of this kingly figure. And the end result is that it's more beautiful. And so I wonder if that's part of the answer. If the synthesis of evil into good via beauty, because good is more powerful than evil, is part of the answer.
Well, one of the themes that I've been exploring in my work as a painter for 30 years is what I've, for lack of a better way of describing it, called a broken beauty. And if you Google a broken beauty, or there's a number of texts out there. There's some that have been commandeered by other people that I wouldn't recommend. But one of the things that I've discovered in my own process as a painter is that destruction is oftentimes the occasion in my own process as a painter of something better. We know from the scriptural account in Genesis that the Lord destroyed the world with floods to cleanse and to restore the good, the true, and the beautiful, as it were, that had been desecrated by humans. I know that in my own process, oftentimes, if you get up close to one of my paintings, you'll see many layers, palimpsests, pentimenti is another word that they use in Italian for layers that break through to upper layers when the upper layers are scraped away or sanded down or lost. And we find that that's true in a lot of artifacts that we dig up, that they're quite the patina of age, the patina of loss even and destruction can sometimes bring a beauty, a kind of poignancy and a beauty to it. And so that's something I've been employing quite consciously in my work now for about 30 years, which is allowing for the so-called accidents and losses and destructive processes to remain in the final image. So my paintings are not tightly knit together. If you get up close to them, and I hope some of your listeners will make it to one of my exhibitions at some point, get up close enough to actually touch the painting. Museum people get very upset when I tell them this, but I actually, the last exhibit I had down in Dallas, Texas, I told a group of school children, middle school kids, who'd come to see the exhibition and with whom I was having a little chat. I said, well, if your hands are clean, you're welcome to touch my paintings. And their teacher said, no, no, no. And the kids ran out and they were just rubbing their hands all over my paintings. And it was fine. Probably improved the painting a little bit, But no, there's a tactful quality and to that sense of broken beauty. And I think that's God's amazing capacity to reclaim, Satan meant it for evil, but God claims it for good. God works all things for good to those who love God and are called according to God's purposes. So I think that theme in Silmarillion, where Iluvatar incorporates the discordant into the symphony, is just a sign of God's love and his ceaseless creativity. I mean, it's almost as though someone were, singing some, as you said, sour notes, and the conductor says, wait just a minute, and then takes out a pad of paper and says, let's try this again, but let's try it surrounded by these notes. And suddenly this new harmony emerges.
Well, that's exactly what occurs, and Melkor is frustrated. This is Sauron's boss, by the way, for those who don't know. This is the original Dark Lord. He's just endlessly frustrated because good turns out to be more powerful than evil, beauty more powerful than ugliness, and he can't play any theme that doesn't have its origin and end in God.
Right. One of the mistakes that people make, modern mistakes in moral reasoning that people make, is to think that evil is the opposite of good. It is not the opposite of good. It is a cancer, a small cancer growing on this colossal thing we call the good. Or as Augustine said, it's the absence of good in that area. But I think of it as more like a disease. But it's not big in the sense that good is big. I mean, because good is not big. Good is infinite, endless, ceaseless, boundless. Evil is something localized and will eventually be expunged.
Yeah. We keep coming back to Inklings here, but this is exactly the point that Lewis and Tolkien both make, where, Frodo and Sam are on the slopes of Mount Doom. They look up at the clouds and there's stars showing through. And Sam says, look, Mr. Frodo, there's beauty up there, beauty that is forever up there and the evil can never touch, no matter how powerful it gets. And then in Lewis, in the space trilogy, the funny part is deep heaven, aka all the universe except for Earth, is just thrumming with angelic life, all on God's side. And there's this little speck within the orbit of the moon called Tulkandra, and that's the silent planet. That's us, because our angel went bad. And the whole war is all the cosmos against this one little rebel planet. And he's already landed here and is defeating the evil. So yeah, it's a tiny, infinitesimal cancer, as awful as it is. There's a concept that you bring up in this lecture that fascinated me as well. And you reference Lewis when you talk about this and his, I think it's called Experiment and Criticism, where you said that in order to fully appreciate a work of art, the viewer or listener or whatever it is reader must be willing to submit themselves to it in some way. What did you mean by that? And why is it important?
Well, let's start actually prior to considering the question of encounter with a work of art or music or poetry. Think about the encounter with another person for a moment. If you come to that person with expectations, with demands, with a list of do's and don'ts, with characteristics that you expect and want fulfilled, and this happens all the time, you will end up objectifying that person. You will not actually encounter the person. You will only experience some aspect of that person at best, but certainly filtered through your expectations. So you're really not encountering that person. You're certainly falling short of entering into relationship with that person. So the objectification of a person is a form of violence. It's unlove. And I would say the same thing is true of a work of art, music, poetry, etc., dance, theater. These are things made by humans for other humans. They are part of a personhood, the exercise of our personhood and our godlike. I mean, we are made in the image of God. And if there's anything that we know about God, God is creative. So clearly, the image of God in us is our capacity for creativity. So when you encounter a painting or a poem, you need to let go of your expectations, let go of your presuppositions and your preconceptions, and actually try to encounter it. Now, sometimes that can be difficult because it may be foreign to you, it may be unfamiliar, it may be, it's like when you think about different kinds of persons with different traditions and customs, it's challenging for someone, say, who's only known New York City, or maybe New York City is a wrong example, maybe some hamlet outside of New York City, to go to India and then meet with people whose language he doesn't speak, whose clothes look unfamiliar, whose skin color might be a little different, whose language sounds different, and their music certainly is very different. Their food is, way too spicy. I mean, so what happens to that little local person who's never been out of that little hamlet is they get shocked by the encounter with another person. Well, so you see where I'm going with that analogy. When you encounter a work of art that's unfamiliar, exercise humility. Don't assume that because it's different, it's somehow wrong or bad or less good. It may be that you need to do some work to learn Hindi, for example, or listen to some raga music, or eat a little Indian food, maybe a little with less spicy version of it, introducing yourself to the actual cuisine. Encountering a work of art requires a fundamental act of receptivity and hospitality and an unguarded kind of posture. And that's what I mean by submission, is where you actually allow yourself to be met by that work of art and allow yourself to actually meet that work of art. And Lewis, in his book, Experiment and Criticism, uses, in one of the first chapters, I believe, uses actually the use of pictures, works of art, as just an example which the book is about literature and about how we read, how we come to texts. But he uses, interestingly, at the beginning, he uses visual art as a kind of a metaphor for what his theory that he's trying to propose. And that is, he says, people who buy a postcard of the Grand Canyon, for example, buy that postcard because it reminds them of their experience of the Grand Canyon. And they might look at it once or twice and put it up on their refrigerator or something, and then they ignore it. They're not using that picture the way one encounters art. It's just a memento. And it's part of their own personal experience, and it doesn't challenge them. If you had that same person stand in front of a great Michelangelo, say the Sistine ceiling, it'd be a different thing altogether, because you need to do a lot of work to encounter the murals of Michelangelo or Da Vinci or whomever. You need to let down your guard. You need to encounter the work in a fresh way. You need to let go of your preconceptions. That's what I was arguing for in that lecture. And of course, I got a lot of help from Lewis's idea that one ought to approach a text with an openness and a willingness to risk being changed by it. Otherwise, you won't encounter the text at all. You'll only encounter your own expectations in a badly filtered version of that text. And that goes for art, poetry, music, etc.
Right. You mentioned that art enables us to access the farthest reaches of the beautiful, reaches that we haven't encountered or comprehended yet, but nevertheless need to be reached and seen and heard and felt.
Right. I mean, if artists, speaking of my discipline of visual arts, if artists have any role in the church, it would be to point beyond the shallow, preconceived notions about what's beautiful, and to help our brothers and sisters in the church glimpse the glory of God, which is, and the beauty of God, which is beyond anything we can possibly imagine. But it's certainly, we know from what God has created in the nebula, and I go back to the Webb telescope photographs, we know that it's a complexity and intricacy and power that's overwhelming to our minds, our intellects. It's not what is beautiful, like God's goodness and God's truth, is inexhaustible, an abundance that we can barely comprehend. And we can't comprehend it, in fact. It overwhelms us. But I think the role of the artist is to point away from our preconceived little confined definitions of what's beautiful and open it up to aspects of God's glory, which may be beyond human comprehension, beyond our nice, neat, settled ideas about what's considered beautiful.
Tell me what you think about this, because it's an idea I encountered recently, and it has really resonated with me. And that is that one of our chief problems today is not that we have embraced something ugly, but that we have stopped seeing altogether. And so the example this individual gave was architecture. He said, look, I know that everyone, has talked about the weird postmodern buildings and stuff. And he's like, I don't like those either. But the one thing you can't say about the postmodern buildings is that they were not designed with an aesthetic intention in mind. They were, and that's their central point. The real problem with modern architecture, as an example, is that almost all of it is designed with purely function in mind, without any aesthetic considerations. Beauty is utterly left out of the picture of, for instance, a sterile office space with a drop ceiling, fluorescent lights, and drab cubicles where everyone sits. There is no aesthetic consideration in that. It just is. It's just function. And this lines up with something you said in the lecture as well about how everyone should carry a sketchbook in their back pocket because it forces us to see again. What do you think about that idea of not seeing, and what role has it played in the loss of, our aesthetic senses?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I would like to say is when we're children, we are encouraged to learn to read, to do simple math. We're encouraged to learn how to write. And in classical culture, you would be also expected to learn how to observe and draw, because drawing, like writing, is a fundamental way of coming to grips with some aspect of those three transcendentals. So, for example, we think of goodness, truth, and beauty. Truth certainly is mediated through logic, the logos, and through reading and writing. Beauty can be accessed through observation. And the best way to learn to observe carefully and to note the complexity and the beauty of and the pattern of our God's creation is to spend a lot of time looking. The easiest way to spend time looking is to have a piece of paper and a pencil in your hand, or a little sketchbook, because it slows you down. If you try to record what you see, you have to look at it more carefully. And the longer you spend with it, the better your drawing is going to be. Now, you don't want to get obsessed with your drawing, because it's not the drawing that matters. It's the thing you're drawing. For example, I'll think back to when I was in seventh grade. I drew a plant that's called Queen Anne's lace. I don't know if you know that plant, but it's very complex. It's like a series of little tiny flowers and clusters that make up this big flower.
We have a ton of them here.
Yeah, it's a very common plant. But I was interested in trying to draw it, and I spent hours and hours and hours, and I finally did achieve something of a likeness. And my teacher took it and paraded it around the class and made a big deal out of it. And I was really a bit shocked at his reaction. He loved it, and he said, "This belongs to me. Now your parents can fight me for it, but they'll never win." And I'm sure that had something to do with me deciding to become an artist, or at least some sense of motivation. But no, in order to draw anything well, you have to spend time with it. And I also joke with my students. I've joked with my students saying, if you carry a sketchbook into any public place, you can sit and stare at anything you want as long as you want with that sketchbook in hand, and no one will think you're creepy. In other words, we all get it. we know that someone who's drawing something has to spend a long time staring at it. But if you're just sitting there staring at something without a sketchbook in your hand, you definitely look like a creep. I had an experience at the Metropolitan Museum. I was sitting and looking at a Velasquez painting of the Supper at Emmaus with my sketchbook in hand. I must have spent at least an hour and a half looking at that one painting. You know, you go to a museum, you think you have to take in a million things, but I just sat looking at that one painting. And a group after group after group of Japanese school children were coming through. And they were just hanging all over me and like snuggled up against me and watching me draw and chattering away in Japanese about what they were seeing. And one of them just put her head on my shoulder. Somehow she thought it was safe. You know, because I was there with a drawing pad, she knew that this guy was safe. And she just sat there watching me draw for probably a full 5 or 10 minutes. And then her classmates yelled at her, "You got to come." And so, or I'm sure that's what they said in Japanese, but then she took off. But there's something about carrying a sketchbook that is, everyone understands that person has slowed down. And that's what we all really want to do. We want to rest in beauty. We want to have it envelop us. We want it to fill us. And the best way to do that is to slow way down.
I like what you said about reversing the process, where normally we walk through the world and we look at something only so long as it takes us to place a word on it, right? So we look at a tree and we go, tree. Okay, that's in my mental space. That's in my world now. It has very limited uses for me, right? My main concern right now is not crashing into it, right? You haven't appreciated the tree for what it actually is. You don't know what species it is. You don't know how old it is, how big it is, what part of the forest it makes up, what kinds of animals live in it. None of those questions go through your mind. But when you sit and draw a tree, or attempt to, you are reversing that process. You're going from the word tree back to the reality of the thing that you have signified and filed away mentally. And all of a sudden the world opens up for you again and you see it. It's not part of the background. I loved that. It was a great way of explaining it.
Yeah, no, I think that unlearning of the conceptualization of everything in our field of vision is really critical to learning how to draw. One thing you said that I'd like to maybe end with, you mentioned the idea of if you're drawing, you're attempting to render that tree. And I think behind that word attempting is a judgment on your own ability. But what I want to say there to anybody listening or tuning into this podcast is you can learn to draw. You just have to practice. But don't look at your drawing as an end in itself. Your drawing is a means to another end, a much better end, and that is to really enter into the beauty, complexity, intricacy, and glory of God's creation. And you'll get better at drawing if you do it often, the same as you got better at doing numbers and writing. But you have to start somewhere. And anybody can learn how to draw, just as anyone can learn how to write. You can learn how to write. Not everybody's going to be a poet, right? Most people can learn how to sing, and I know people say, "Oh, I can't carry a tune in a bucket." Well, but you can still sing, and it's a good thing to draw. It's a good thing to slow down enough that you have to look carefully. Don't judge your own drawing harshly. Give yourself a chance to get better, but spend time with it because it does require, it's a demanding thing like learning to write or read or do mathematics.
Well, Dr. Herman, this has been fun. Is there a next step? Is there a text or a resource that you would point listeners to who are just curious and hungry for more and want to take the next step in their learning on beauty and art? Where would you point someone like that?
One essay that's meant a lot to me is an essay called The Relevance of the Beautiful by the German philosopher Gadamer. That's spelled Gadamer. It's not easy reading, just as you started off in our conversation, you were talking about reading Jeremy Begbie's book. It's dense and rich, but I would strongly suggest that it's worth it. The Relevance of the Beautiful by Hans-Georg Gadamer is a beautiful essay, and it's also will give you tools to begin to think more deeply about the beautiful. Another would be Lewis's Experiment in Criticism. It's a marvelous book about learning how to read well. And then I would say probably George Steiner's book, Real Presences. These are pretty heady essays. I mean, Lewis's Experiment Criticism is not a popular kind of level reading. So it's for people who really are up to the challenge of trying to sort through some pretty complex ideas. Same thing with George Steiner's book, Real Presences. But it's interesting, at the very beginning of that book, Steiner proposes, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also quite seriously, he proposes a new kind of republic in which the only criticism of work of art that's allowed is another work of art. So the only music criticism allowed is another sonata. The only poetic criticism allowed is another poem. In other words, the critic in his republic needs to do the hard work of learning that craft before they presume to pass judgment on the work of another. He spends a full third of that book, Real Presences, making a case for something he calls criticia, which is intellectual hospitality, where you let down your guard, you welcome the author, the painter, the poet in, even if they're potentially dangerous. It's like showing hospitality to strangers. As it says in the Bible, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for some in so doing have entertained angels unawares. And the heart of that admonition is the word strangers. That means you don't know who these people are. They may be good, they may not be good. But you're being told it's time to let down your guard. It's time to stop playing it safe. It's time to welcome the other into your world. And Steiner argues that that's how we ought to encounter works of art, works of music, poetry, etc.
What an eye-opening conversation on the important subject of beauty. My guest today has been Bruce Herman, Professor of Art and Distinguished Chair in the Fine Arts at Gordon College. Professor Herman, thanks so much for joining me on Upstream.
Thank you, Shane. It's been a real pleasure.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.